Michelle, you got to start the webinar for the
Got
attendees.
it. Got it.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the 2022 Policy Institute. Thank you for joining us today. Before we get started, we are excited to offer today's webinar in both English and Spanish. Thank you to the team at Language Services Solutions for being here today and providing this service. I'm going to turn it over to them right now to kind of give you some instructions and explain to you how this is going to work. So Christian or Felipe, whichever one.
Good morning, everyone. This is simultaneous interpreter Felipe, and I'm joined by my colleague Christian, and we're here to provide simultaneous interpretation services. Buenos días a todos. Soy intérprete Felipe. Estoy aquí con mi colega, el intérprete Christian, y vamos a proporcionarles instrucciones sobre cómo conectarse a la interpretación. We're going to provide these instructions first in English and then in Spanish. To select English, if you're joining us from a computer, click on the globe-like icon at the bottom right of your Zoom window, then select English. If you're joining us via tablet or smartphone, click on the three dots at the bottom right of your Zoom window, then click on Language Interpretation, then on English. If you do not select any language, you will not be able to hear the interpreters. Para seleccionar español, si se nos unen desde una computadora, seleccione el botón que dice Interpretación en los controles que están en la parte de abajo de su pantalla y elija Español. Si se nos unen desde una tablet o celular, hagan clic en los tres puntitos de la esquina inferior derecha de su ventana de Zoom. Luego hagan clic en Interpretación de idioma y después en Español. Si no seleccionan un idioma, no podrán escuchar al intérprete cuando hablen su lengua. Over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Christian. And thank you both, Christian and Felipe, and the whole team at Language Service Solutions. We've enjoyed working and collaborating with you throughout these institutes and want to thank you for making these events more inclusive. In the bottom of your screen to the right, please see where there is a globe icon and select the language you would like to hear today. If you are on your phone, instead, click the three dots and select the language interpretation in whatever language you would like to hear it in today. You should then be able to hear the audio in the language you selected as well as the original speaker at a lower volume. If you would like to mute the background speaker, click the globe again and select Mute Original Audio. So a note for all our presenters today. Please speak slowly and allow some pauses, as this will help our interpreters greatly. Again, thank you to our team at Language Service Solutions for being here today and providing this service. I will turn, for the next 3 hours, we're going to be joined by a fantastic group of speakers and experts to share with us about how storytelling can be used to achieve change and to make an impact. Your MCs for today are myself, Stacey Morgan. I'm Executive Director of the Mental Health Transformation Alliance, and I will be joined by Malia Rose Waters from Prevent Child Abuse, North Carolina. For closed captioning today, you will need to click the CC icon and select Show Subtitle to turn captions off, and click on the CC again and then hide subtitle. So we'll leave that up there for a few minutes. Should you need that, closed caption is available. Just follow the instructions on the slide. All right. So the 2022 Policy Institutes will focus on storytelling to achieve change and to make that impact. Stories are lived experiences that we recall in order to share what has happened to us. They will enable us to connect across differences and embrace our empathy and humanity for each other. Our stories can unite us toward a common goal and inspire us to seek justice. The speakers across these two policy institutes this year will be sharing a variety of storytelling tools and techniques. And many of them have their own personal stories they would like to share with you all. Before we get started, we have a few housekeeping items. we want to cover. We want to thank you all for logging in to join us today. Please type any questions you might have in the chat or question and answer box, and we will do our best to make sure it is answered. PCANC's communications team will be live tweeting this event, so make sure you check that out at PCANC and use the hashtag North Carolina NC Policy Institute's 2022 ! And again, that is hashtag NC Policy Institute's 2022 ! And additionally, we are recording today's institutes, and they will be shared with you by email following the event. Thank you to our sponsors. Advocate level sponsors include Youth of North Carolina, WellCare, Sandhill Center, United Healthcare, and Partners Behavioral Health Management. Supporter level sponsors include Via Health, Alliant Health, and Town Bank. And we appreciate the support from the Essentials for Childhood North Carolina team. Without your commitment to improving outcomes for children, youth, and families, these events would not be possible. Thank you so much. We also would like to thank the Planning Cabinet, Prevent Child Abuse North Carolina, the North Carolina Collaborative for Children, Youth, and Families, NC Child, Eye Center for Integrative Health, NCIOM, North Carolina Institute of Medicine, and Mental Health Transformation Alliance. This is the first of the two policy institutes hosted by PCANC and North Carolina Collaborative for Children, Youth, and Families, and all the sponsors on the Planning Cabinet. The next one will be next week, for a week from today, on October 26th from 9 until 12. We will continue the conversation on the importance of storytelling to achieve change and make impact. If you have not registered for the next institute yet, we'll include the link in the chat. Please register for that institute, because this link that you used to get on today will not work for the one a week from today. So make sure you register for both if you would like to attend or at least receive the recording. Now let's meet our speakers. Our welcome speaker today is Madhu Valamir from the North Carolina Department of Health and Human Services, Division of Child and Family Wellbeing. Next, we will be joined by Tanya Bhattacharya, Thought Leadership Strategist, Luminous Marketing, as our keynote speaker. And after Tanya, we will take a short break and we'll return to hear a video from youth advocate activist Elijah Lee, who many of you who attended last year know. Then we will welcome Lamine Perkins, co-director of the community engagement from North NC Child, and several special guests will have a conversation about how storytelling has impacted policy change from the perspective of a policymaker as well as people who have lived experience. So let's dive right in. Please join me in welcoming Madhu Valamir from North Carolina Department of Health and Human Services, Division for Child and Family Wellbeing. Madhu?
Thank you, Stacy. Good morning, everybody, and thank you so much for inviting me to speak at the Policy Institute today for 2022. It's such an honor to speak with you all. My name is Madhu Valamiri, and I'm the Deputy Director of the Division of Child and Family Wellbeing at the North Carolina Department of Health and Human Services. And I'm so thrilled for this year's Policy Institute theme of storytelling to achieve change and make an impact. So I want to welcome you all and thank you for taking the time to dedicate yourself to this critical work and to this community of practice that surrounds us here at the Policy Institute. So today I want to tell you about a few of the ways that storytelling really matters to the work that I do and our team at the Division of Child and Family Wellbeing does every single day. But first, I actually want to tell you a little bit about the new Division of Child and Family Wellbeing here at the North Carolina Department of Health and Human Services. We are really excited to have established a new division that is focused on child, youth, and family well-being earlier this year. And it brings together programs and services that primarily serve children, youth, and their families. The programs that are now in our division were previously in 3 different divisions at DHHS across public health, mental health, and social services. And we have unified these programs in one division with the aim of really integrating these behavioral health, physical health, and social programs and services that support kids and families to provide coordinated and streamlined care and services that really addresses the whole child or the whole person. And the impetus for establishing a new division was both the growing needs of children and youth and their families, especially as we have come out of this pandemic and seen the increasing needs across behavioral health, nutrition, and many other areas, combined with the increasing recognition that some of the most effective strategies to meet the needs requires a coordinated and cross-sector approach. So our division has over 900 staff that work across the state of North Carolina. And just wanted to tell you a little bit about how our division is structured and what programs are part of it. So our Division of Child and Family Wellbeing includes 4 key programmatic sections, which are number 1, the Food and Nutrition Services section. That is North Carolina's SNAP program, which serves over 1.6 million participants in providing critical dollars to purchase food. Second, we have the Community Nutrition Services section, which includes our WIC program that serves over 250,000 families with young children and provides nutrition benefits, nutrition education, breastfeeding support, and healthcare referrals, as well as the Child and Adult Care Food Program, which provides reimbursement of nutritious meals to childcare facilities, adult daycare facilities, and other institutions to promote healthy eating. Third, our division includes the Early Intervention Program, also known as the North Carolina Infant Toddler Program, which provides critical services to our youngest kids under 3 who are experiencing developmental delays and may have special needs. And then finally, our 4th section is called Whole Child Health and brings together programs that really span physical, behavioral health, and social needs for children and youth. And this section has programs that range from nurse consultation in our local health departments, home visiting programs, genetics and newborn screening, child behavioral health programs and policy support, and then finally support for our children and youth with special health care needs. So by bringing together this array of programs and services that range from prevention all the way to crisis support for children or families, our division is equipped and positioned to make connections across these areas around how to reduce barriers and increase access to programs and services for families, really keeping that laser focus on the needs of children and youth. So in my role as Deputy Director of the Division of Child and Family Wellbeing, I oversee the 3 major federal nutrition support and education programs, FNS, our SNAP program, WIC, and the Child and Adult Care Program. So with that overview, I now want to tell you about some of the ways that our Division of Child and Family Wellbeing and our Department of Health and Human Services really prioritizes the value of being people-focused through storytelling and through listening to and being responsive to what we are hearing from the people that we serve. So in our day-to-day work, it is paramount for us to hear about issues that our children and families are experiencing and really work together on possible solutions. So families often turn to our department and our division in many cases in times of challenge and even crisis. And the feedback and the experiences that we hear directly from families is one of several ways that our teams are surfacing issues that families might be experiencing on the ground or in their local communities and working to make change. So the first story or example I want to share with you all is really about the infant formula shortage, which I know many of you all have been following closely. This is an ongoing challenge that has been so difficult for families with our youngest children in North Carolina over many, many months. In fact, this has been going on since late last year that we have been having supply chain issues, but really peaked this summer with some of our worst shortages. And during this shortage, our WIC team in particular has worked really hard to make a number of federal flexibilities available to families so that we can increase the number of formula options that a family can get at the store with their WIC benefit. And over the past few months, we've spoken to a number of different stakeholder groups about how the formula shortage is affecting them, including hearing directly from families. So several months ago, our team was connected to a mother who participates in the WIC program. She had a preemie and she was having trouble finding a specialty formula for her baby. And she had been driving around to a number of stores, but her usual formula that was listed on her WIC prescription was not available at the store because of these shortages. Normally, in order to get whatever product was actually available at the store, she would have to go back to her pediatrician, possibly her local WIC agency, to get that prescription changed, since it only allowed for one product to be listed at a time, and then go back to the store and see if it was available. She reached out to us, really asking if there was anything our state office could consider to make it easier for her and other parents to get whatever formula product was available at the store, regardless of what her prescription was for, given this crisis. Our team took this recommendation under advisement. We moved quickly to change our WIC policy to allow and actually encourage healthcare professionals to list multiple specialty formula orders on a single prescription. We changed our forms and provided guidance to our local WIC agencies so that we could be responsive to the needs of families. And we're grateful to this mother who got connected to us for lifting up the very real challenges she was experiencing, and also bringing solutions that we were able to change successfully. So while we do have a number of families that we hear from when things are very challenging, we also work on a day-to-day basis in a number of different avenues to work directly with youth and family groups in a more proactive approach as well, less crisis oriented, to be forward looking and inform policy through several different initiatives at the Division of Child and Family Wellbeing. Some examples include we have a commission for children and youth with special health care needs, where families and professionals share their stories that informs policy, advocacy, and programmatic changes. We have a youth health advisors group that specifically includes youth with special health care needs that really informs some of the efforts that we recently did, like trying to understand the impact of COVID on youth mental health through a survey tool. And then another example being our work with youth and families who are involved in residential care to really inform how we redesign residential services and psychiatric residential treatment facilities. So we work with a number of youth and family groups to collect written stories, videos, and photos to really capture these efforts and to lift them up. So we know it's important to be responsive to families during moments of crisis, like the formula shortage, but also to have structures and channels where family members and youth are at the table with us for proactive planning work. that is really thinking about how we better build systems to serve kids and families. So next, I want to also talk about how we use stories to really lift up the successes of our teams and demonstrate the work that our staff does every day and how it makes a difference for our partners and for the children and families that we serve. So these stories, especially celebrating the wins and successes, really underscore and highlight the value of our amazing workforce that day in and day out work for the state of North Carolina with a mission of supporting child health and well-being. So I want to share an example of a story that really paints the picture of the way that some of our teams are making a direct impact on families in North Carolina. I mentioned that our division includes early intervention, also called the North Carolina Infant Toddler Program. And we have around 700 staff who work across the state at our children's developmental service agencies across the state. And they provide critical services to our youngest kids that are experiencing established conditions or developmental delays and are in need of supports and services to ensure they're on track and thriving. And our staff work in our CDSAs as speech therapists, physical therapists, family navigators, interpreters, administrative staff, and many, many other staff positions that are so important to helping our families with some of the most vulnerable children and complex needs navigate our often fragmented systems. And so the Infant Toddler Program collects surveys from families about their experience in our program. And I just want to share a quote from a mother and her son that I think really exemplifies the value that our team members add to families' lives. She said, "I am a first-time mom, so everything is new to me. When my son's pediatrician recommended getting evaluated, I was terrified. During the initial virtual evaluation, everyone was so kind, thoughtful, and mindful of my emotions. I literally cried because I just felt like I failed my son and I should have done more to prevent this. The early intervention team reassured me through my tears and continued to explain the process in a way that I could truly digest. I wish I could remember everybody's name, but my coordinator was truly amazing. She has been by my side, even when I forget to email her back, and I couldn't ask for anyone better." I think that quote first deeply touches me and reminds me and grounds me in the real person-to-person contact and impact that our teams make. And I think the work we do in government is so hard. Some of the challenges that we face and that we're helping our families through are, really, really deep and thorny problems, and that we're working to overcome systems that weren't designed with our kids and families in mind, and that need to be strengthened. And these stories help keep us going and show that positive impact that our teams are having, and remind us that what we do has a very real and tangible benefit on people's lives, on children's lives. So I want to now shift to just tell you a little bit more about how we're looking ahead in terms of some of our strategic priorities for the Division of Child and Family Wellbeing, and how storytelling and family voice is important to our work. One of our top priorities for the division is to really enhance nutrition security, food security for our kids and families. We know that although we were able to implement a number of waivers and flexibilities during the pandemic, like pandemic EBT, and many of the waivers in the WIC program and SNAP program that have helped families access benefits despite the challenges of the pandemic, we know that there continue to be at least 1 in 5 children that are still hungry in our state. And so we still have more work to do to ensure that every child can access the food and the healthy food that they need. So at the Division of Child and Family Wellbeing, we are working to develop a state action plan for nutrition security that really shows kind of collectively what is the work that we are doing at the division and the department to move the needle on child hunger and nutrition security. And one of the things that I'm so excited about our division is that we are really one of the first states that has strategically and intentionally brought together our SNAP program and our WIC program under the same division, which we think will really maximize the opportunities that we have with these major federal programs to increase the reach of programs for families who might benefit from the services. So one of our strategic goals for our actual department, not just the division, is working to increase the number of North Carolina families that are eligible for programs like SNAP and WIC, but not yet enrolled, and working to increase that enrollment rate. So we have set out bold goals in our strategic plan. We're hoping to increase the enrollment rate of families in the SNAP program to 90% and the WIC program to 75%. And we have partnered with a group called Benefits Data Trust on a 2-year strategic effort to really build the data infrastructure at our department to first match data on families who are enrolled in one program, let's say SNAP, and eligible for WIC, but not enrolled in WIC. And from there, we're really working to develop tailored outreach strategies to reach families to increase that participation rate in programs like SNAP and WIC. And our team has had some opportunities to conduct early interviews with families who participate in some of our nutrition programs, and also speak with community leaders and partners. And we have learned that, there are still misconceptions and fears, understandably, about using public benefit programs, particularly among our Latinx community. Unfortunately, as a result of previous public charge policies, which just made us realize that we have more work to do to communicate and educate families about accessing benefit programs, particularly in light of recent public charge changes. And then another takeaway that we heard from some of our earlier interviews with family members, one family member said, "You don't know what you need until it's presented to you," which really reminded us of the value of outreach and education to help families know about programs and services that they may be eligible for and benefit from, in addition to simultaneously thinking about the policy changes that we need to make to our systems to make it easier to access in the first place. So in closing, looking ahead, we are eager to partner with many of the organizations here at this table as we further build out our strategy around nutrition security and addressing child hunger. We're really hoping to build in some human-centered design processes to inform this work, to really put families that we serve at the forefront as we think about redesigning systems to better meet the needs of families. So in wrapping up, I just want to share how I see the value of storytelling and informing policy change. In the Division of Child and Family Wellbeing, all of the programs and services that we offer either directly or indirectly support the needs of children, youth, and their families. And stories are critical to helping us as policymakers and program administrators really understand how programs are being experienced day to day by kids and families, both in the times when things are working really well and people are getting the supports and services they need, as well as in the times when our system is not working and needs to be improved. Storytelling helps connect us to the day-to-day experiences that reflect our shared humanity. And in many cases, all of us here are all trying to make the world a safer and healthier place for our children, the children in our lives, as well as children more broadly across our state. So I encourage each of you who work with kids and families to work with us at DHHS to really help connect these stories and lived experience to our policies and programs and help us generate solutions together to many of these thorny and challenging problems of our time. Together we can go farther. Thank you again for having me this morning, and I hope the rest of the Policy Institute is excellent.
Thank you so much, Madhu, and thank you for being here this morning. Thank you so much. We would now like to transition to our opening keynote address delivered by Tanya Bhattacharya. Tanya, I am going from, she is with the Thought Leadership Strategist, Luminous Marketing. Tanya, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Stacy. Then I'll go ahead and share my screen so we can get this going. Thank you so much for having me here. This is such a wonderful event. I'm so excited. And, so I really believe that stories are our strength, and there's a quote that I love that really guides this for me, which is really, one day you will tell your story of how you overcame what you went through, and it will become somebody else's survival guide. And that could be, us, that could be, directed to the folks that we serve, but really stories are such an incredible, tool for change. And so my first introduction to the power of storytelling happened when I started my career working for a addiction treatment center that served women and their children. And those children lived on site with their moms. And so I was actually tasked with collecting impact stories that we could use in our advocacy work, right? And so I started doing that, and I started getting to know our patients and getting to know our alumni and hearing their stories. And so often when we would sit down and start, pulling their story out of them, pulling their narrative out of them, those narratives were so rooted in the pain and the shame and the guilt of addiction, especially that, that special brand of shame that moms and pregnant women carry when they have that disease. And so together we worked on reframing that narrative into one of courage and resilience and strength. And so over time, I watched how those women became advocates for themselves in brand new ways, right? In their families, in their legal situation, and just in the world in general. They just became advocates for themselves. And so the biggest lesson that I learned here is that when you change the story that you share about yourself, that story that the world begins to see about you and your community starts to change. And through the years that I served in that, social impact space, I realized that what we think of as competition or invisibility or being a best kept secret, that is a myth, because our universe is so abundant with decision makers and power brokers, ambassadors, board members, donors, clients, right? Any type of audience that you want to grow. And I think the real competition for us in advocating for the work that we do is noise, right? It's distraction. It's a chaotic world that gets more and more chaotic by the day. And so I think that the real challenge for us is actually obscurity and figuring out how to transform from that, misunderstood, best kept secret kind of thing to that go-to top of mind advocate for an audience that can help you accomplish your mission. And a big part of that is sharing our stories. A big part of that is sharing our stories. And I know that you are completely committed to advocating for children, for youth, for families. And so sharing your stories, whether it's your personal story, the story of a person that has been served by, a person served, your organizational story, the story of the future and the vision that you're working on creating. Yes, that means that you have to get in the limelight for a little bit, but only because that light reflects back on your mission so that your audience can learn about the need, identify how they fit into your world, and become inspired to take action on your behalf, whether you're gearing up for an advocacy campaign, a legislative season, maybe a year-end giving appeal, or something else. And the reason that I'm so passionate about this, part of the reason is that I like to say it almost saved me when I was in the trenches, wearing lots of hats, knocking on doors, pounding on the pavement, just trying to get people to know about our work. And I had a visionary boss and mentor, and she wanted me to help her with her storytelling strategy. And so I helped her midwife her story out into the world through LinkedIn content and scheduling times for her to share her personal recovery story with local corporations, all that kind of stuff. And we also continue to share the story of our patients and alumni, always from a, strength-based perspective, always rooting their story and their resilience and their courage. But we shared those stories, and we started to see a shift happen. And it wasn't immediate, like it took a couple of months, but then we started to notice a significant change, right? People would approach her at conferences and ask her specific questions about her unique ideas. And we started to attract the right advocates and board members and investors and champions in a way that felt serendipitous or magical, but that's the outcome of telling our story, right? Reporters came out of the woodwork and asked us to provide our insight on policy changes that were really happening on a statewide level as subject matter experts. And so pretty much we were just attracting a steady stream of interested people who wanted to come alongside us because they were inspired by the stories that we shared. And so I've seen in a couple of ways how storytelling can help you achieve change and drive impact. And we hear that all the time, right? But why? Like, why is that? And actually, I'm going to tell you about why. So why does storytelling achieve change and drive impact? I'm going to talk about what makes stories compelling, when to use storytelling as an advocacy tool, kind of shed a little bit of light on like, who are your storytellers? How do we apply effective strategy, like storytelling strategy? And then where do we share these stories, right? Yes. And so I want you to think about that the last big advocacy event or fundraiser or, campaign, or really any big thing that you attended. And I want you to consider if you remember all the facts and the figures that were presented. You probably remember some because you're passionate about these topics and these issues, but I would definitely bet that you remember at least one story. Stories are memorable, and it's our stories that, attract others to us as they see themselves reflected in your journey. Storytelling is immersive. It helps people imagine a future that they haven't yet been to or they can't see. And progress is really contingent on a group of people having a shared sense of purpose and direction. I mean, we literally talk about getting on the same page, right? And so that's why they're such a deep catalyst for change, because they're a cornerstone of human connection. They kind of break the illusion that we're separate when in reality, we're all interdependent. And there's been studies done where they did MRIs on the brains of people who are watching movies. And the lateral prefrontal cortex, which is the part of the brain that's responsible for self-awareness, it starts to go dim. You forget your body, you forget your theater, you forget the chair. You're actually transported so that you're no longer just like sitting in a presentation, right? Or reading an ebook or reading a letter that's been mailed to you. They're actually in that story, right? I was just reading the chat. Yeah, thank you for saying that. They're in the story live with you. And so going deeper, why is that? Like, why is it programmed into us to be wired for story? And part of the reason for that is storytelling is actually a survival skill. So humans don't have the same physical evolutionary advantages as other predators like lions or bears or, tigers. But we have actually adapted storytelling as a specific opportunity to solve problems, work together as a community, escape predation, create a better world for ourselves. And it really helps us cooperate and again, get on the same page and innovate at a large scale. So before we had email sequences and podcasts and websites, cavemen told stories. It's always been how we've passed information on from one person to another, one generation to another. And so I have found that as long as we've done our research and we're working with the right community, it's rarely the case that we are asking for too much or that the right potential supporter didn't have enough bandwidth to get involved. But instead, it's that we haven't told the right story. The story that shares the message behind what you're, advocating for, the why behind it. And so the outcome of telling stories is trust. Stories build trust in a way that nothing else does, right? Trust can only be earned. And so I was intending on showing you my most favorite example of impactful storytelling, but I think instead I'm just going to make an executive decision because we're running just a tad bit behind schedule. I'm going to go ahead and have the team send this out afterwards because, and some of you may remember, this actually going live in 2018, but it's Oprah accepting like a Lifetime Achievement Award on the Golden Globes. And so it's 9 minutes long. So I'm not going to show it to you, but it will be sent out to you afterwards. And when you watch it, I want you to really, you could either just sit and enjoy, you could just, enjoy this beautiful masterclass in storytelling, but I want you to think about when you watch this, if you can, some strategies that Oprah uses to be such an effective storyteller. And I'm going to share a few of them with you because just in case you don't get to watching it, she created, it's like a masterclass on storytelling, and we can also use these same techniques in your own storytelling for your advocacy efforts. And yes, as Malia says, I really do encourage you to check it out. And so, Oprah, when you think about Oprah, right, she's prepared and she's ready, yet she's natural and conversational. So she has eye contact with the people in the audience. And so if at all possible, when you are sharing a story in person, try your best to be conversational, maybe have your notes, but don't look at them the whole time. I know it's tempting to want to get things exactly right, but as an audience member, something is lost when the speaker is constantly looking down at their notes. So how can it come from the heart? I also want you to consider beginning with a story right off the bat, because when you begin a speech, you only have a few moments to really hook the audience's attention. And so you want to make those moments count, right? Psychologists talk about a concept called primacy and also recency. And so people tend to remember the first and last thing they hear. And so the opening and closing of your presentation are really important. And you will note that I began this presentation immediately sharing a story of my own career. I didn't really introduce myself or, ask about the weather. And, those are all things due because speaking is nerve-wracking. But if you can just get into the habit of launching into a story, people will begin to listen in kind of a different way. Another thing that Oprah does is she shares a personal story, a very individual, vulnerable story, and then she widens the lens to tie it into a larger vision that affects humanity as a whole. And so, when you can focus on one person, it helps people really relate. I know I used to work in the addiction treatment space, and if I talked about the stats of, there's 23 million people that struggle with addiction, it just becomes a statistic. But when I talked about my story, when I talked about one woman who suffered with the disease of addiction, like, it just makes it real. Right? It just makes it real. And in that story, how can you include clear adjectives and descriptors? So in the Oprah thing that you can watch afterwards, she says, his tie was white, his skin was black. I was on the linoleum floor, bone tired from cleaning other people's houses. And so she says all that instead of simply saying like, oh, I was poor, right? Or like she's showing and not telling, she's painting a picture. And so how can we do that when we advocate for the families that we serve? There's a circularity, right? Like I said, she starts with a powerful personal story, but then she closes the loop at the end and, talks about how that story ended up. And, that's especially powerful as alumni or people served in your, the people that you have served begin to share their stories as ambassadors. Couple of other small things, message repetition. For better or worse, people really hang on to strong key messages, especially as they're repeated. They take on a life of their own. And so how can you repeat key messages that are important to you, your organization, your mission, your campaign? How can you, infuse that into your stories? And then of course, Oprah's just a master at this, but voice, delivering her pitch. her pacing, the pauses, her charisma. And so I really do, as Malia said in the chat, encourage you to watch that after the fact and let that, guide your own storytelling as you go out into the world and do your thing. Because, and also the thing is, when I share that video, a lot of times people say, but I'm not Oprah. It's like my story wouldn't have that same impact. Like I'm not going to get a standing ovation. And I want to reframe that because you may not have clout with the Hollywood elite. I don't either, but that's probably not your audience. And through telling stories, you can become an Oprah-like figure for your audience, right? That inspiring, caring, visionary change maker who is painting a picture of a different world so that their audience can really see it and feel it and be inspired to join you in that vision. And so again, if we are clear about the change we want to create and why, and share stories about it with our audience, we can activate those audience members into supporters to help us make shift happen. Because we can't do what we're doing alone. We can only create the future we want to see by actually bringing other people along on our journey. So I want to talk a little bit about when to use storytelling as an advocacy tool. And I think a great example of that is actually how stories can smash stigma or help illuminate misunderstood issues. And there's a great example of the overturn of the abortion ban in Ireland in 2018. And, in cases when we're working on misunderstood issues, and I think that if we work on issues pertaining to families, to youth, and to children, I think that, storytelling and communication just has to become part of our mission, because it helps change hearts and minds to get people into a place where they're really willing to listen and then willing to help. And so the abortion ban in Ireland was overturned in 2018, and people came out in full force in overwhelming numbers to vote. And after that vote, 39% of people who were polled on, 39% of people who were polled said that what changed their mind was a conversation with family or friends, where a family member or a friend actually, shared their story with them and specifically talked to them about why they should make that vote. And actually thousands of people with experiences with an abortion broke their silence and inspired people to speak up. And this was not done by accident or happenstance. It was part of a really well done grassroots campaign that, modeled positive values-based storytelling. And at that time in 2018, abortion had been banned since 1983. And so just about everyone had a story about abortion, whether it was them or someone in their life. And so advocacy groups actually partnered with the Minister of Health in Ireland and other influential agencies in the government, NGOs, and just other agencies to really work together to ask others to pledge to have conversations with people around them. They created conversation cafes where people could come and hear stories about this. They created badges that supporters could actually wear. And it said, talk to me about repeal. There was conversations trainings so that people could practice sharing their story, because that's a hard thing. It's a vulnerable thing. But they actually gave out messaging templates so that they could use from Facebook Messenger to start a conversation online about abortion care. Because sometimes, we live in such an even more of a digital first place than we did in 2018. And so as the vote got closer, the campaign actually matched up undecided voters with strong pro-choice folks to spark conversation, inviting them to get into conversation digitally. And in addition to all of these volunteers sharing their story, there was a unified front of tying it into a larger vision where abortion is simply part of healthcare and everyone has the freedom to decide whether and when to become a parent. And so stories help turn this issue around, which was previously just untouchable. So it doesn't, whatever your politics are, that issue was unspoken about and totally stigmatized. And so really it was stories that helped it begin to be in the common conversation and helped it actually really have a significant policy change in a short amount of time. And so with that, like, who are your storytellers? Because we all have so many stories to share. And when we're in the work, sometimes it can feel like, gosh, we're just one person. How do we get these stories out into the world? And oftentimes your volunteers, board members, community members, people that have been affected by the work that you do, alumni, again, the people that you serve, they are looking for more ways to get involved and help. And they have so much passion to tap into, and they have a really rich and deep personal story. And sometimes they just don't know how or where to share it, or if they're saying the right thing. And so you can actually provide them with some nudging to share their stories and some training and tools. And the fact is, many people just don't know what to say when they have an opportunity to talk about the cause or the campaign that they're so passionate about. I worked in nonprofit fundraising, which is a little bit different from advocacy. It's related but different. And I once had a board member ask me, if I get a chance to talk about this cause, what should I say? Right. And so perhaps at your next community gathering, or perhaps a special storytelling focused gathering, you can ask volunteers and ambassadors to share the story of why they're involved. And depending on the stage of your nonprofit or your organization or your agency, you can ask some of the initial founders who got it started, depending on how long it's been around, to actually come in and share their personal stories of getting everything started and what that was like and why. And it just helps give you a deeper and richer perspective of that mission, right? And then you are a storyteller, and the rest of your leadership. And when I say leadership, I think everybody in your organization is a leader. And I know from personal experience that it can feel weird to share stories, especially when they are our own very vulnerable, deeply authentic stories that we don't normally share out in the world because of a variety of reasons. And what I want to say to you is that there is somebody out there who needs to hear that story. And there's a person out there for whom it will motivate them towards taking helpful action. And I want you to, when you're getting ready to share a story, to take a moment and really think about that person, really visualize them in your mind. And you're in part telling your story for them, because again, like when you step into the limelight with your story, it reflects light back onto your mission. And so there is a leadership development practice that was developed by Marshall Ganz called public narrative. And, it was used by Obama and many other orators and storytellers. And so there's 3 specific stories that he suggests that we practice and share with others and really grow into. And it's not about like memorizing these stories, but really about letting them emerge for us. And so if you and your organization have these 3 stories in mind, you're in great shape. And so those 3 stories, the first one is the story of self. And that's a personal story that Ganz says, it shows why you were called to what you have been called to do. Everybody has a story about an experience that got them involved in a certain cause or campaign or mission. And so there's 134 participants here live with us, and all 134 of you have a personal story of why you are called to what you have been called to. And so what is that story, right? If you haven't spent time thinking about that, start to really think about that, because that again is such a powerful tool for change. The second one is a story of us. And that's a collective story that Ganz says really illustrates the shared purposes, goals, and vision of a community or organization. And so that focuses on a challenge or a choice that you've made or an outcome. And so what is the challenge that is facing your community right now? And what is that story? How can you tell that story? And then finally, the story of now is about the challenge that the community faces and the hope to which we aspire to based on the choices that we have to make to get there. So there's always some urgent challenge that you can present to the listeners of who you're getting in front of. So what are you raising funds for? What are you advocating for? What are the policy changes that you're passionate about creating? And what is the vision of a world in which that that has happened and now exists as a result, right? And so those are the three stories that I would suggest every advocate, every change maker, every leader kind of has in their go-to storytelling library. And so that story of self is a personal story. The story of us is a collective story that, it's a collective story. And then the story of now really speaks to what is that urgent need that you are working on what you're working on, right? And this is, again, not going to be something that you script and write and read from. It's learned, it's practiced. You tell it, you listen to it, you reflect on it, you tell it again, so it will change and fluctuate over time. But anybody can be a storyteller for your work. It just takes a little bit of foresight, right? But then once you have these stories, where can you share them? And so, an elevator pitch or an elevated pitch with decision makers and interested parties. And so, we all go to gatherings. Many of them are digital now, but sometimes they're in person. And you've all been to an event where they kind of pass around a mic and everyone gets to talk for 30 seconds. That's an opportunity to share a story, not just to talk about what you do, because again, people forget about that. But when you share a story, that's something people can latch onto. So what is a 30-second story about the work that you do? How can you infuse a quick story, from a person served into that pitch so that people really remember that? You can share them in conversations with family members, with elected officials, with people who disagree with you, because people, it's hard to disagree with somebody's lived experience. Like, it's hard to just say, no, that's wrong. And so a story is a way to change hearts and minds. If you're on LinkedIn, you can share, you can change your personal profile, which so often reads like a resume. But when you incorporate a story or the why of what you do, or a story from a person served, right? Like a really strength-based story of, why you're passionate about your work, it can serve as a resource. And so that's something you can also encourage, if you work for a nonprofit, your board members to add a section to their LinkedIn profile about the story of why they chose to be involved with your organization. On your website, right, on your About Us page, maybe don't just have a picture and a little bio, but incorporate a little story of why that person is involved with your cause. And by the way, that About Us page is such a frequently visited page because people want to get to know the people behind the work. And so when you can infuse story there, it just lands in a different way. Many of you who are advocates and leaders in your space, you're going to be interviewed for podcasts, for presentations, for webinars. And when you can start that podcast interview with a story, and maybe it's probably going to be your personal story, but it doesn't have to be. It could be a unique strength-based story from somebody that you've worked with. That really reflects your mission. And yeah, so don't be afraid to do that. And then, of course, all of the kind of, normal places, appeal letters, campaign materials, social media posts, especially now if you're gearing up and getting ready for a year-end campaign or the launch of a campaign, now is a very good time to be sharing those client, staff, volunteer stories in the form of videos, in the form of testimonials, and just any kind of story to really prime folks as you get ready for your year-end season, whatever that might look like. And then so finally, I want to speak to a little bit around how do we tell an effective story? So one of my favorite story structures that is really great to train people up on is that myth, fact, story, need. And this is a really great option to share with your volunteers, with ambassadors or advocates, maybe board members, who aren't immediately inside your organization every day doing direct service work. But if you are doing direct service work, it's also a great story structure. But it's just a great thing because it's memorable. And I like it because most advocates work on a stigmatized or misunderstood issue. And if they weren't misunderstood, there'd be plenty of funding and support for them, and we wouldn't have to advocate on their behalf. And so this story structure is very simple. So myth, fact, story, need. And so I'm going to give you an example based on a story that I would tell often when I was, kind of in the trenches advocating for women and moms and pregnant women who struggled with this disease of substance use disorder. And so a common myth or stereotype that I would hear is that, some people still think that just say no works. And they blame women who are struggling with addiction for not having the moral willpower to simply just stop using drugs and alcohol. That's a stereotype that I hear all the time. But the fact is that addiction is actually a diagnosable disease, right? It has a pattern of symptoms. It's a chronic condition. And it's progressive, right? It's even people with all the resources in the world can't necessarily beat substance use disorder on their own. And then I would share a story, and that could be either my own personal story, that could be one of the dozens of stories that I had of a person served. And in that case, I would try to pick a story that was geared towards the place that I was in, right? And who I was talking to, so that it was relatable. And then the need is, in the story, while that person had the ability to stay in treatment, and a family who believed in getting her the help that she needed, so many women and families do not. And so we have got to pass legislation to fund longer term residential health stays. Can you imagine a world where everyone who suffers from substance use disorder not only got the help they needed, but didn't face stigma when they were asking for that help? Right. And so you kind of add in a little visionary statement at the end. And so the reason that the story structure works is because you and your storytelling ambassadors likely hear these myths out in the world. Again, we work on misunderstood issues. And so when you hear a myth or a stereotype or something that's just plain wrong, having this framework in your pocket or the back of your mind is kind of an easy framework of what to do when you hear a myth being shared, right? You can then share a fact, share a story that reflects that fact, and then share a need or a vision that exists, right? And having these or practicing these or getting into a community meeting where you can all share one, that allows the people who are passionate about your mission to start to feel really comfortable advocating on its behalf. And so a couple of things I want you to remember is that you can start at the end and work backwards. And so done is better than perfect, and progress is better than perfection. Oftentimes, something that happens when I work with people to really midwife their stories out of them, whether it's an advocate or a person served or an organization, is we get hung up on telling the perfect story or doing it perfectly or wanting to get it 100% right. And so just remember, you don't have to be perfect. Perfect is not even realistic. People are not attracted to perfection. They're just attracted to relatable human stories. People will always remember how you made them feel versus, oh gosh, that person had a typo in their slides. They're not going to remember that. They're going to remember the stories that you shared, right? And you can practice bravely with safe friends, co-conspirators, because practice makes progress, right? Again, it's not about perfect. Practice makes progress. And so as you're getting ready to share your stories out in the world, think about just one person and really visualize them in their mind, where if they heard that story, it would really resonate with them. It would stop them. It would make them think. And more importantly, it would make them feel. It would make them wonder, like, okay, how can I support this work? And so again, storytelling is one of our greatest tools in helping to co-create a new future. I hope this has inspired you to try it out, and just remember that your stories are your strength. Anytime that you infuse data or numbers into a presentation or an advocacy campaign, also put the same amount of stories in there. If you're looking for more, Malia put my website in the chat. I also have a podcast about storytelling called The Campfire Circle, because again, we talk about a boardroom table, but I think the Campfire Circle, where we share our brave stories, is that new place of leadership. So feel free to stay in touch. Thank you so much for letting me share. Yes, Susan says I'm going to go ahead and go to previous slide as Susan suggested, and I'm going to go ahead and pass it back off to Malaya.
Tanya, thank you. This was incredible. So much information here. And I'm going to remember myth, fact, story, need. I think that is the perfect way to lay out the stories and advocacy. And when you're trying to impact change, so important to remember that. We will be sending out a recording, I mentioned in the chat earlier, of this institute and the one next week. If you're okay with it, we'll also be sharing these slides with you all. So you'll have that in front of you, the myth, fact, story, need. Please take a moment to check out Tanya's website. There's so much really great information on her website. Listen to her podcast. Really do appreciate you being here with us today. And also, she is coming to us from California, so it is quite early in the morning. So thank you so much for coming early in the morning with enthusiasm. We are so appreciative. We are going to take a short break here in a few minutes, just to give you an opportunity to stretch your legs, check your email. I encourage you too to go and read about our speakers. We have the link in the chat where you can go and read about everyone that's going to be presenting. Tanya has set us up for the rest of the presentations that you'll be hearing today, as well as next week. So this was fantastic. So thank you. When we come back from the break, you all that were here last year for our institutes will remember Elijah Lee, who is the youth activist who gave such a compelling story to us last year. He is back this year with another video to share with us. He is a high school student, so he recorded his video in advance to share with us. So we'll hear from him in the break, after the break, and then Lameen Perkins from NC Child and other special guests will have a facilitated conversation about stories in action. So we will take 10 minutes now. I will see you back here at 10:25.
Welcome back, everybody. We hope you enjoyed your short break. Just as a reminder to speakers as we move into this next segment, to please speak slowly when speaking to help assist with the simultaneous translation that is happening. So up next, we are going to hear from our featured presenter, Elijah Lee, who, as Malia stated earlier, has recorded a message for you because he is in school. And some of you may remember Elijah from the 2021 Institutes. He is back this year with a new and inspiring message to share with everyone. We hope you enjoy.
Hi, my name is Elijah Lee, and I am so excited and honored to have an opportunity to speak to you all today about storytelling, as well as a little bit about my story and how I got to where I am. Like I said, my name is Elijah, and I'm a 14-year-old community activist. I currently live in Chesterfield, Virginia, but I'm originally from Roanoke Rapids, North Carolina. So while I am coming to you virtually and via video, shout out to all my Halifax County people in the room. Now, I also want to start off just by saying thank you to each and every one of you here. Your presence here boldly states that you are prepared to really get involved with advocacy. And I'd be remiss if I didn't send a special thank you to Prevent Child Abuse North Carolina. I remain extremely grateful for all the work you all do every single day to better our communities. And without further ado, let's hop right into it. Okay. So as I said, I want to talk a little bit about telling your story, and I want to kind of use my story to help guide me a little bit. And so let's get right into it. So first, I want to recognize the power in storytelling. And I have this first because we cannot talk about storytelling and we cannot talk about the importance of it without recognizing the power in it. I want to start off by saying that your story matters, and it is crucial that you share it. Now, I know that I am speaking to many of you, and however, I want this to be an individualized message. And I hope that each and every one of you understand that your story matters, and there's so much power and impact that your story has. And this is why it's so important to share it. And this is why we're having institutes like this, is so that we can allow everyone to understand your story and how you got to where you are today. We know that storytelling can be used in so many ways, from empowering other people to tell their story to even creating a space where we can all be vulnerable. We know that storytelling is similar to dominoes, and that by you taking the risk, taking the leap of faith to share yours, other people may be inspired to share theirs as well. And this is how we create communities of safe spaces and environments where it's okay to be vulnerable, and that's how we get growth. We know that storytelling can also be used to learn more about who we are, as well as move forward in specific realms of advocacy. Our storytelling can be used to help other people understand what it's like to experience certain things. And our storytelling can also be used to allow other people to resonate with who we are and have that level of empathy. We finally, with our stories, we have the ability to make long-lasting change. We can use our stories to create foundations to our communities. We can use our stories to build strong environments and create avenues of success for everyone in our communities. Our stories can be the very thing that helps save and impact and change lives. And I think that's something that's really cool, just about you taking the time to share your story. Stories have started as a way for people to relate and learn from each other for centuries and millenniums, and we are merely continuing the task. And so lastly, your story has the ability to change the standpoint in any situation. Your input and your advice, how you got to where you are, that has the ability to make profound effects on our world. And so it's more important than ever that you take time to share that with everyone. So now that we understand the power in storytelling and the really why it's important, let's get into storytelling itself. And so we start from the beginning. Our story is not always, well, our story's beginning is not always the first step of action. It's not always the first march or the first social media post, the first blog post, the first article we read. Our beginning could oftentimes be maybe our first exposure to an issue, our new education concerning an issue, maybe a personal experience, and you recognizing that and reconciling with that. Maybe starting from the beginning means a new level of self-awareness that you've received, or even sometimes having that level of empathy. Collaboration with others can be the reason you start. Now, identifying this point in our lives, while hard, it is necessary. I say this because every story has the beginning, and every story has roots. And these roots are the foundation of every story. So just as you're building any house, you start with the foundation. You start with understanding, how is this house going to stand up? And this is where it stands up. And so it's going to be hard sometimes, right? Because oftentimes our first exposure to an issue means that someone is experiencing a level of pain. Maybe our personal experiences mean that we have to recognize a pain that we ourselves have felt. And even when we look at things like collaboration with others and our empathy, we recognize that even for this to be the beginning of our story, we have to then understand that someone that we know and love has experienced a level of pain. And so while this is hard, while it's going to always be hard, we know that this is the thing that catapults us into the future. And so I want to talk a little bit about my beginning. My story starts with the first grade, and I first learned that a friend of mine was being abused. This was considered my first exposure to child abuse, and it put a burden on my heart to understand that this was the reality for someone that I cared so deeply about. It was the reality for someone that I called friend. And so I had to go home and had some tough conversations with my mom, and we really learned and talked about child abuse and neglect, what that meant, the impact that it had. And from there, I felt an urgency to do something. I felt an urgency to get involved. I couldn't sit silent any longer. I had to do something. And so then that's when I really started to educate myself and really started to begin the action period of my story. And so before we get into acting itself and really changing everything, we have to ask, where does our action come from? So after we process the beginning of our story, we then have to redirect the conversation. Where did you understand there was something you could do? And where did you get your ideas for involvement are two of the main questions that I tend to ask myself when I'm looking at this kind of period of my story. For me, I found a lot of passion and a lot of motivation in things like history. If you can't tell already, I'm a massive nerd. And so I remember reading my mom's old encyclopedias, and I remember going on my mom's Google on her phone, and I would just look up all these historical events. And I just remember learning and learning and learning and growing. And these are the things that soon and later motivated me to get involved. However, yours can be from a local resource. Maybe you were inspired by things from social media to really get involved. And so finding what motivates you, that allows you to better understand where you want to go in your field. We know that identifying our inspiration for action also allows our listener to better understand where we come from. It allows those listening to our story to understand how do we get here and what can they do to help. And so this is also how we segue what we need from others. So like I said, I personally was motivated by history. I was able to learn about the civil rights movement. And I learned from people like Congressman John Lewis and the Children Who Say the power and importance of young people being involved in this movement. I learned from them that our young people have a seat at the table. So it's beyond important that we begin to take it. I learned sacrifice from people like Emily Davison and Emmeline Pankhurst. These people taught me that while these times are challenging, it is necessary that we sometimes give a sacrifice in hopes of bettering our communities. And I learned the power of using my voice from people like Fred Hampton and Assata Shakur. Now, the power in using your voice, I ask that if you don't remember anything else, may you always understand that. May you understand that the words that you say have the power to change the course of history. And you may feel like I'm being dramatic and blowing this out of proportion. However, I promise you I'm not. And so find someone that can teach you about the power in using words. Find someone that can teach you and maybe even begin to understand that the words you say have the ability to change the course of everything in America. And so we have to be able to use that voice for the change that we need. So what now is what we're asking ourselves. Is that now that we have identified our story in the beginning of that story, while we have identified the roots, we also have to now look to our action, right? And we look to our motivation for that action. So there are numerous ways to act on issues. We can lead and host community events, things such as marches, maybe resource fairs. We also offer these types of resources, right? There's numerous ways to do that. In the age of technology, we have things like email. And so you can simply send something out that has a list of resources, hotlines, contacts. Something that I really want to emphasize on using are things like social media. Our young people are necessary when we're looking at things like fighting child abuse and neglect. Our young people are absolutely necessary. We're really considering changing any American issue. And one way to get in contact with our young people and connect with our young people is through the use of social media. And so you can use social media to post about certain instances, post about certain resources, post about certain events, and to really make sure that our young people are there, present, and getting involved. We know you can also get involved in legislation. Talk to your legislators, talk to those representing you to make sure they're putting in legislation that represents what you need and what our communities really need, especially when it comes down to things like child abuse and neglect. Another thing is things like raising money through philanthropic efforts, and using this money to better our communities financially is another big one. And then lastly, spread the word about issues. And so I give you these things to not serve as a checkbox that you can check away and to kind of say that you've done this and I've talked to my legislator and I use social media and I have offer resources. But you are able to use lists just like these to find what fits you. Everyone is different. Everyone acts different. Everyone has a different level of motivation. Everyone finds something different. And so I ask that you go through this list to find what works best for you, and that is your action. Just to now tell you a little bit more about my story, it really begins with the life of activism, right? And I love this quote, "Be the change you wish to see in our world." And this really started because I remember feeling so heartbroken and so down about our world. And I really understood that while yes, I still sometimes feel sad about the things that go on in the world, I also have the ability to change it. So I'm going to give it all I can while I can. And so this kind of goes back to our previous slide in that I was trying to learn about different things that I could do. I was trying to learn about different ways that I could make change and different ways that I could be the change. And analyzing the thing that I was motivated by, which was history, I remember learning about these phenomenal marches where our communities rallied together for a single cause. However, something I do remember is that all the books I read did not tell me at all how hard it was to sometimes lead a march, right? And how hard it was to sometimes organize a community. And so through organizing a march, I wanted to get permits. I wanted to make sure I was doing everything the right way. I wanted to have speakers. However, the most important part to me was community partnerships. I wanted these to not only be times where we recognize child abuse, we reconcile with the fact of that, and we really begin to act on it, but I wanted to make sure that my community was coming together, not over me, not over some 10-year-old holding a sign and a megaphone, which I don't know who gave me a megaphone as a 10-year-old. But I wanted to make sure our community was coming together over our young people. I wanted to allow them the opportunity to really lift them up. And so that's what a lot of my marches were about, getting youth involved. So from those marches, I got a little bit of recognition. Now, as you can see, this site is not titled recognition. It's titled spreading the word, because the Marva's Hair Project, Kelly Clarkson, People's Magazine, all of it, it was never about me. It was never about Elijah Lee. It was never about the fact that he led a march. Spreading the word and this recognition to me meant that we were showing other young people that it is possible. As I said, I come from a low-income community. I'm obviously a person of color. I'm a young man of color. And so we know the stereotypes that are against those types of things already. However, most importantly, I'm a young person. There are stereotypes that said I should just sit down and be quiet. I said, stay out of grown folks' business. I shouldn't be talking about this stuff. This is too hard for me. I should just stick outside and just relax and mind my business and just have a nice childish life, right? However, that wasn't the case anymore. And I needed to let other young people understand that in our world, yes, there's hardships, but we also have the ability to change that. We have the ability to rise to the occasion and be the change we wish to see. And that's what spreading the word meant to me. So hopefully those instances brought a little relief to other young people. So after the marches, it brought me to something else. And this was a new line of advocacy for me. And that was the pediatric safe rooms. And this is when we took uninviting hospital rooms and we converted them into child-friendly spaces. And I really started this after I found out that after being found in abusive situations, our young people then go straight to the hospital just for checkups and things of that nature. However, I also grew up in a household where my two older brothers played a lot of football growing up. And so I was very familiar with what hospital rooms looked like, unfortunately. And I remember even in that space, it was sometimes uncomfortable and I just didn't want to be there sometimes. And so I couldn't imagine what it was like for other young people who were being found in these situations. And so I started at Vidant North Hospital in North Carolina, which is my local hospital, and we raised $3,000 to renovate these rooms. And then upon our move to Virginia, I wanted to do something similar. However, this is going to be on a much larger scale because we weren't just renovating a room, but we were building an entirely new room, building it from the ground up, making sure that it is a trauma-informed care space. And so with that being said, I am so proud of my community just to say that we have raised over $12,500 to make sure that we are fulfilling these properties and making sure that we're having trauma-informed care spaces available to every single young person, which I think is so powerful. So from the pediatric safe rooms, I still wanted to do more. I had this passion, this burning love for just helping and working with my community. And so with that in mind, I, with the help of some phenomenal people, started Hero Voices Incorporated. We are a nonprofit organization dedicated to the empowerment of young people through offering resources, whether that's connections, partnerships, finances, whatever they need, in an effort to simply empower the youth voice. Now, there are a couple of things I love about Hero Voices, but the most important thing that I love is that our board, is that we have a board full of law enforcement officers, of teachers, of anyone that you could possibly imagine. And this has allowed for me to personally grow. These people have brought ideas that I would never, ever think of to the table. And I've been working in this for the past 5 years. However, these ideas have allowed us as an organization to grow and to help more young people. And so what that means, so with that being said, I asked, what does it mean to grow, right? So we live in this ever-changing world. We live in a world that is constantly moving and constantly fluid. And so sometimes we have to adapt, and we have to adapt to use our story. So adapting means we grow and we change so that we can continue to have the impact we need to make the change and to be the change we wish to see. So adapting means that we're keeping an open mind. We're continuing education because we know that there's always more to learn about an issue. We're trying numerous ways of advocacy. If one way doesn't work perfectly, then we try another one. We're reaching out to different people and we're moving into different rooms because it is important that we're cementing those connections and we're getting those connections and getting that new voice in the room. But most importantly, we're never letting fear stop us. In this realm, it's easy to get intimidated. It's easy to feel like we don't belong. It's easy to feel like that our voices don't matter. But I promise you, they do. I promise that you have the power to change the world. You have the power to change the course of our history. And so it's really important that we're not letting fear get in our way. So with that being said, and understanding that sometimes fear does get our way, we also have to look at things like resilience and understanding obstacles. When I was 3 years old, my father unfortunately passed away. And this was difficult for my entire family. And even growing up, it still is difficult. However, through all of this, I learned that we are resilient. I didn't label this slide my hardships or my obstacles or something that I had to overcome. I labeled this slide resilience to serve as a reminder that while we're going to experience hardships in our advocacy, we're going to experience times where it's really difficult. We may experience traumatic events. We may have past traumatic events. We are, as humans, are resilient. We have the ability to overcome anything that is in our way. And that is something that is absolutely beautiful. So to kind of wrap all this up, I say that our stories are always important. Our stories always need to be shared. It is sometimes up to us to be the ones to share them. Our stories are ever growing and ever changing, and there is no end. And so I don't call our stories books because to me books end, but I said I call them chapters because chapters, while they sometimes have a closing, there's always another one to follow. And so our lives are a series of chapters and our stories as the book they're in. And so we look at things like find your beginning, find what motivates you, and what form of action works best for who you are. These are the 3 things that usually comprise of my story, so maybe that comprise of yours as well. Be selective in partnerships in your time. Your time is worth it, and you matter as a whole, so make sure we're watching that as well. We must continue to learn and adapt. Our worlds are ever changing, our lives are ever changing. And so we have to be able to move with the flow to find what works best for our community. And finally, we must always stick together. We can't do this by ourselves. We can't do this alone. We have to be able to move through this as a collective. Finally, when one falls, we all fall. But when one rises, we all rise. I remain so grateful for this opportunity to speak to each and every one of you here today, and just simply the opportunity to share a little bit more about my story. And hopefully, as you all go back to communities, you will take time to share your story with others and truly rise so we can all rise again. Thank you so much.
Wow. As always, an awesome message from an awesome young man. He's amazing, and it has been fun watching him grow up. We were talking the Planning Council, watching him grow up over the institutes. He is awesome, and each time I hear from him, I learn something new and something that's inspirational. So for our final segment today, we will be joined by Lameen Perkins, Co-Director of Community Engagement at NC Child. And Lameen is going to share with us about how storytelling can impact policy change. She will then have a conversation with Ebony Burnett from the YMCA of Greensboro and leads the Guilford County Child Advocacy Network, and then Claire Herman from the NC Child and an advocate, Tiffany Farrell. So Lameen, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you for
You're
that
welcome.
warm welcome, Stacy. And thank you for having us. I am really, really, really excited to be here today. I want to introduce my other panel, the other folks who will be joining me, but I also would like to share a few slides before we get to our panel discussion. And so, Stacy, would someone be able to give Claire permission to share?
Yes, that will. Can we give Claire? There we go.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And so, as I mentioned, very excited to be here with you all today and really excited to be joined by two people who I feel like I've learned from with regards to our story collecting work, and who I think will have some important nuggets to share with you all today. I am unable to, okay, I can turn my camera on. And so to get us started, Claire and Ebony, maybe Claire, would you go first and just take a moment and introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, I'm Claire Herman. I'm communications manager at NC Child, and I work closely with Lamine.
And Ebony.
Hello, my name is Ebony Burnett. I'm the Senior Association Youth Development Director for the YMCA of Greensboro, and I lead the Guilford County Child Advocacy Network.
Thank you. And I am going to go through these slides somewhat quickly, just because I feel like we have already had such a great foundation laid for us by Chris and Tanya earlier this morning. But to get us started, I wanted to talk a little bit about our flow for today. As I mentioned, next slide, please. As I mentioned, we're going to do a brief presentation, do a little bit of level setting and getting on the same page. I am going to be talking with you all about some of the lessons that I've learned at our story collecting work at NC Child. We're going to have an opportunity to talk about, to listen to some stories and then talk about what it looks like to use those stories in advocacy. And then we're going to bring Ebony and Claire into the conversation and talk a little bit more. Next slide. And so I wanted to make sure that we were all on the same page when we think about storytelling, because storytelling, as our previous presenters have mentioned, is something that we all do. It is a big part of our lives. It's something that has been used for ages, and it's really deeply tied to our families, our culture, and our society. Stories really remind us of, stories show up in our lives in TV, in music, in the arts, in books, even in commercials. And so I think that we're constantly hearing stories and processing stories. And stories really are a form of data. They are an effective tool, not just for passing down history, but really also just for us thinking about who we are as a society, and for thinking about how our culture shows up and what our identities are. I know that I grew up listening to stories from my mother, from my grandmother, and my dad, and I'm sure that many of you have done the same. And so I wanted to kind of share that framework because I wanted to acknowledge that there is so much expertise and wisdom in this virtual room, because as I mentioned, we collect and we hear stories every day. We all have stories that we bring to the table. And so throughout the conversation, I definitely want to encourage you all to bring that wisdom that you all possess to this space. I hope that you all will be able to gain something from this presentation, but I also hope to learn something from you all too. And so in that spirit, I will go ahead and get us started with talking a little bit about how we use storytelling and advocacy. It really is a form of education. When we think about storytelling, what we're trying to do is we're trying to educate and inform and inspire, whether that is policymakers and decision makers, the general public, or advocates and stakeholders. All of those folks that we share stories with is normally with a goal in mind: to change hearts, to change minds, and to inspire action. There are lots of different ways that we use stories, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. But some that really come to mind is when we are bringing folks down to meet with elected officials, whether that's on Zoom or on Jones Street. And we have someone that is willing to share their story. That is a form of direct advocacy. That is stories in action. And then we also share them oftentimes with the general public, doing things like social media campaigns and things like that that are really designed to educate, motivate, and inspire the public in order to take an action whether that is voting or something else. Next slide. And so in my role at NC Child, one of the things that I've been really fortunate to have had be a really big part of my work is to grow our story collecting process. Sharing stories has always been a big part of the work that I've done at NC Child, whether that is sharing stories from young people who are affected by a particular issue, or collecting stories around the impact of healthcare on families who participate in the Medicaid program. Our health policy advocacy has really probably been our most robust effort around storytelling. And it's really emerged as one of our key tactics as we advocate to expand Medicaid in North Carolina. I say that it's a journey, but I feel like it is really a never-ending one. Stories, we get different things from stories at different times, and different stories can play different roles in helping us to get the policy wins that we want to see for children based on what is going on in the advocacy process. And so I think of this as a journey, and I think of it as one that we are all kind of collectively on together, and we are constantly learning lessons along the way. When I first started collecting stories at NC Child, for NC Child, I didn't have a background as a trained storyteller or story collector. It really was something that we have worked on and refined that process throughout the way and throughout our journey. Along that journey, though, I have learned some lessons, and I am excited to share some of them with you all. And so today we are going to talk about some tips around planning, recruitment, consent, story collection, storyteller maintenance, moving storytellers up that ladder of engagement, and then using stories effectively in our advocacy. And so, like with anything else, I think the first thing that it is important for us to do is make sure that we have a solid plan. We need to make sure that we understand, what does success look like? Is it Medicaid being expanded, or every school in your county or in the state having a nurse? Is it paid family medical leave? Or is it fully funding public schools? Knowing what success looks like will really help us kind of hone in on our strategies, help us understand who our targets are. So who are we targeting this story toward? Is it an elected leader whose heart and mind we're trying to change? Or is it raising awareness with the general public or inspiring them to action? Once we know what the goal of our story is and who the audience or target is, then we can think about what are the sorts of, what is our angle? What sorts of messages or characteristics are probably going to be most impactful? One example of this is if there is a legislator who maybe has done some advocacy around supporting families with complex or unique needs, how can we think about making sure that when we are bringing stories to them, is there a way that we could try to kind of play to that passion that they have for this particular group in order to help that elected official understand how this issue impacts the people or a perspective that they care about? In addition to having a target, it's important for us to think about the goal. I know we've heard it said before that language matters. So how do we kind of communicate that goal? What is the call to action? And how do we communicate that in a way that is going to inspire action from the target or allows others to see themselves in the solution? So for example, going back to that example of Medicaid expansion, if that is our goal to see Medicaid expanded in North Carolina, what is the call to action at that particular moment? Is it asking someone to vote yes? Is it asking the general public to sign on to a letter or submit a public comment? Or is it encouraging people with the election coming up very soon to go out and vote for candidates that are supporting this particular issue? The last thing that I wanted to reference really quickly on that slide is just talk briefly about timeline. It's important for us to understand that storytelling work is something that is relational. We need to make sure that we have time built in to build a relationship, time to make sure that we can go back and forth and get consent. We're likely going to be trying to engage people who have other jobs and are sharing their story with us aside from them. They're not being compensated through their employment most often in order to share their story. So making sure that we are able to be flexible, work around their schedule, and making sure that we build our timeline in a way that aligns with us being successful in our intended outcome to make sure that we are collecting stories in a way that is respectful. And so now I'll talk a little bit about recruitment. And here's where I would love for you all to jump in and chime in to the chat. And think about some of the ways that you have maybe recruited people to participate in storytelling campaigns. Some of the things for us to consider are, where are the folks who are most impacted by the issue? Is that the faith community? Are they working with a particular organization? Are they being served by your organization? What connections do you have both personally and professionally within your networks that you might be able to connect with in order to help connect with other storytellers? Are there groups who are active on the issue on social media? And then the other strategy, which has probably been one of our most effective strategies, is really using existing storytellers to help us recruit other, word of mouth, kind of that snowball effect. And so by working with community members and them being bought into the issue and having a positive experience with sharing their story with your organization, they will be more likely to perhaps pass along the message to others that that you can be a trusted partner to share their story in order to advance the shared goal that you all have around whatever the issue is that you're advocating on. And so one of the things that you'll probably hear me say again and again, and I know that other speakers also alluded to it, is that the importance of relationships. This work is incredibly relational. And so when you are working with, when you're working with the community and with directly impacted individuals, I would encourage you to make sure that you add some additional time into your timeline and make sure that we build in that flexibility that it takes to make sure that people have a good experience and that we're meeting them where they are. We're asking people to be incredibly vulnerable with us and to share very deeply personal information. And one of the ways that we can build trust is by being somewhat vulnerable too. Sharing a story is a very effective way to help you get a story. Make sure that the folks that you are engaging have some idea of why you do this work, why this is something that you're passionate about. And doing that can kind of help people feel a little bit more comfortable with sharing something that's personal. The other thing that I wanted to talk about is the importance of making sure that the relationship is one that is reciprocal. Yes, we have this shared vision for something and we're working toward this greater cause. However, the same way that I am compensated for my time and my expertise, compensating our storytellers for their time and expertise, in my opinion, is the morally right thing to do. It shows that we value that expertise just as much as we value the expertise of other folks that we contract with. And it also sometimes can help to offset some of the costs that may be associated with taking time off of work and things like that. While we can't put a price on the emotional labor that storytellers undertake when they share their story, compensating them at least shows that we are acknowledging that. The other thing I think that is important is to be very transparent. Make sure that we're being clear. And I noted on the slide that clear is kind. We want to make sure that they know how their story will be used, who it will be used, how long it will be online, and what they should do if they change their mind. Just because someone agrees to share their story in one given moment doesn't mean that that's something that they're going to be comfortable with a year or two down the line. So it's really important to kind of build that relationship to make sure that those lines of communication are open. The other thing that we can do to try to avoid being transactional with this work is to stay connected in whatever way makes sense. Try to make sure that we're updating people about advancements in the issue. If there is a significant policy change, making sure that we're keeping folks in the loop, letting them know if there's another opportunity for them to engage without pressuring them. The one thing I always say is no is a complete sentence. And so, yes, I will share opportunities for storytellers to share to participate and to take action. But I don't have any expectations in terms of whether or not they will do that. And that leads me to consent. I don't believe in blanket consent, and I think that this is just based on trial and error and some of the lessons that we've learned. People's situations change. And so we want to make sure that we're getting consent at each stage and for each use. So that means during the initial interview, we want to ask their consent to record, to share it publicly, to use on social media, to feature in publications, websites, media. And we want to ask their consent in terms of how they're going to be identified. Is it okay to list their county? Is it okay to list their first name? Would they prefer to have their story submitted anonymously or with their initials or first name only? Getting all of that consent on the front end can certainly make things easier when you get ready to use the story and make sure that we're putting out a story that is really in line with the story that the storyteller wants to tell. Just keeping in mind that it's not our story. So every time we use it, we want to make sure that the people who trusted us with this story feel really good about it. And I can certainly provide more information on that, on consent. And I think our panelists will have some information on consent, but I think that that is a really, really important piece that I wanted to highlight with you all today. And so when we talk about collecting stories, there are dozens of ways that we can collect stories. On this slide, these are a few that we have used, and I've listed them from left to right, with left being online forms, at least on my screen, that being the lowest touch, and the heavier touch being that in-person interview. Online forms allows people to submit their story the way that they want it at a time of their convenience. It is the lowest touch, but it's also been my experience that it requires follow-up. We want to make sure that we want to follow up for consent, but we also want to follow up to cultivate that relationship. And so the way that we've used forms at NC Child is we've used them for leads and then follow up in higher touch ways. That said, I've seen lots of organizations, including our friends at Moms Rising, use forms to do really robust story collection campaigns around issues that they're advocating for. And there's lots of different websites and apps and things and tools that you can use to in order to allow you to do that, ranging from something as simple as a Google form to more complicated software programs like Soapbox that allow people to record videos and submit them and things like that. Telephone interviews is something that we've done. This is a strategy that I typically use more for vetting, for that initial conversation, just to talk about what the campaign is, how we might use that information, and to even see if someone is willing to join us for a Zoom or in-person meeting in order to do a more higher touch story collecting activity. Telephones can also be a really effective way to gather information when for people who may have technological challenges or for who bandwidth is an issue. During the pandemic, we started using Zoom a lot. I think we're all very familiar with Zoom, but it can be a very effective way to collect stories where you have that video component and you also are able to kind of build that relationship. And then last but not least, there's in-person events, collecting stories live, in-person events, or setting up interviews where you go to someone's home, place of business, etc., in order to interview them. So when we collect stories, we use a very specific structure for the interviews. We want to do that introduction and maybe share a little bit about yourself and how their story will be used, trying to build that rapport and build that relationship. We want to be really clear about consent. Again, kind of going through all of those items that I listed a few slides ago. We want to use open-ended questions in order to really allow it to be more of a conversation and for it to flow. At least these are some of the strategies that we found success in. So open-ended questions like, tell us about your family's experience with accessing healthcare, or how has the pandemic impacted your family, or what do you want decision makers to know about fill in the issue. You want to get their contact information, and you want to find out if they're interested in engaging with you in other ways. And last but not least, you want to follow up. In a lot of interviews, storytellers may sometimes disclose that they are struggling with a challenge that there is a solution to, and maybe we know what that solution is, and so if you can immediately connect that family or that storyteller with resources, that can also help to build the trust and help with building that relationship and making it less transactional and more of a relationship that will help move people up that ladder of engagement. So you collected a great story, now what? You want to move people up that ladder of engagement, but before you do that, you want to make sure that you're documenting it in some sort of database. You want to connect the family, as I mentioned, with available resources, do any follow-up that you've promised, and then reach out along the way for other opportunities to engage. Some of the ways that we've invited folks to engage are around issues like, would they be willing to partner with us to where we ghostwrite an op-ed using the story that they shared with us? Would they be willing to contact a decision maker, share their story publicly, and speak with the media? But the one thing that I really want us to be thinking about when we're thinking about moving people up the ladder of engagement, how will we support them throughout that process? And so with that, I'm going to play a quick video from Tiffany Farrell, who is an advocate that we've worked with.
Hello, my name is Tiffany Farrell, and I am a parent advocate who has worked with NC Child and the Favor Foundation to share my story as a mom of children with special needs. I have triplets on the spectrum, and each has different needs, and I helped to make my story known to legislators about Medicaid expansion, because I felt like it was really important for the legislators to see a real person. I think that a lot of times they hear information through secondary sources, maybe through like news sources and bumper sticker type information, but I really wanted to put a person to it so that they could really connect with the experience of people who needed Medicaid expansion. I think that when you have that one-on-one personal experience, it really sticks with the legislators and helps them realize what an important issue some of these issues are and what an impact it makes to real families. And so that's why I wanted to share my story. I also feel like there's a lot of misinformation and a lot of prejudice that rolls around that you can dispel when you have real people talking. So, for instance, in my case, I wanted to show that a mom with kids with special needs may not be able to
And
work.
Claire, I'm sorry to interrupt. Some folks are saying they can't hear the audio. I think if we stop the share and then if you restart it, there's a couple of audio buttons on the bottom of the share screen function. And if you click those enable audio buttons, we should be able to hear it.
And people are saying in the chat they could hear.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, sound is
Okay.
shared, so I'm not sure what else to
Okay.
do, but if someone else has an idea, I'm open for it.
Okay. Great,
think-
thank you. I
I
didn't
think-
realize it wasn't a universal issue. Okay, great, thank you.
I think a majority of us could hear it. So just do it the way, continue where you were at, Claire.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks, everybody. Appreciate your patience.
That gap and really the need to care for the caretakers. And I think it was an angle that so many of the legislators maybe did not realize. And so it brought a real light bulb moment. I could see it. Having Forrest with me, I struggled with that a little bit because I wanted him to go, but I also, wanted to make sure I was being respectful of him. But he did great, and he really enjoyed the time. He made friends with some of the legislators. I couldn't believe how much they just opened up when they saw him. They let him go to their desk. They let them hit the gavel at the legislators meeting. I mean, things that I could not believe that they would have allowed. They just, the walls came down. So, so to me, that's why it's super important to be able to share your story in a personal and meaningful way. The process of going to Raleigh, I'll tell you, it was a little scary at first. Anything new is scary. But I had the phone numbers of the people at NC Child who were helping me. Even when there were a couple glitches, they were quick to respond and help me get into the hotel room smoothly. Once I got to the legislature, Tiffany was super with, showing us around, making sure that Forrest had breaks when he needed them, just making it really a seamless experience. And what I would say for people that are asking for people's story is to really listen to what their worries might be up front or their limitations might be up front, to be respectful of how you can help them. For instance, I needed a travel advance because I didn't have the money up front to be reimbursed for. And that may be the case with a lot of people sharing their stories. Or for instance, they're not sure if their car is going to make it. Just simple practical matters that if you can say, hey, what about this is concerning to you? Or what about this is feeling a little tentative, and how can I help? Also having a good schedule, so that if you have children coming with you with special needs, that you can take care of their needs, during the schedule, and let them know exactly what's going to be happening and when they're going to have breaks and when they're going to get to eat their favorite food or whatever the case may be. So as much information as you can give people up front about what the day is going to look like, even maybe pictures of the people that they're going to be talking to. I know with my son with autism, if he can see somebody in advance, it takes away some of the anxiety of which people he's going to be meeting, or even what rooms he's going to be in. And that can differ from child to child. But what is going to make you comfortable? What is going to make your child comfortable and more at ease in sharing your story? Another thing that Tiffany did that was really helpful was at the beginning of the day, letting us have kind of a practice run through of what we might say when we met somebody. So just that little one-on-one, initial practice run before we hit the floor with our stories. But it was very powerful experience. Forrest felt like he really did have a voice. He's excited about asking how he's doing, what they can do to help. So, it takes a lot of the extra stuff that gets in the way of human interaction out of the picture and lets you be direct and authentic. And I think that is what made the difference for us.
All right. So just 3 things that I wanted to lift up that I think that Tiffany pointed to. First of all, I have so much gratitude toward Tiffany for being willing to record that for us today. But she definitely talked about some of the barriers and how important it was to have a relationship with someone where she could talk through what some of those challenges might be. And she talked a lot about the support that she needed that was unique to her family. The other thing that Tiffany shared, I apologize. The other thing that Tiffany shared was about, thinking about when you're asking for someone to bring a child with them, or someone's going to be bringing the child with them, thinking about what that means and thinking through all of the logistics in advance. So it really points to some of that preparation that we talked about, some of that relationship building and things like that. Next, we are going to watch one more video, a little bit shorter, but you're going to see Tiffany again, along with some other advocates. And then we'll hear from Claire talking about some of the components that went into making this video a reality.
In a lifetime. And think about their kids going on to be independent after high school or after college, where I'm looking at a lifetime. So I need to be healthy for them. Yeah.
And our son Corey qualified for Medicaid once he received the Innovations waiver and received services now to assist him during the day. So we have a lot going on in terms of insurance, but at this time, my husband and I are the ones who are not insured.
We have a son who's autistic. He's 16 now, so he has every kind of specialist and therapist. And then also our daughter actually has special needs. She was just approved with a learning disability, and she has scoliosis. So there are all these challenges just as far as mental health and physical health.
Especially with them having autism and unique needs and a variety of services. And, I'm not just a mom, I'm 15 people in one. So if I lose my health coverage, I can't be who I need to be for them. And I can't do that to my children. That's such a disservice to everything that they've worked so hard for in their life.
Our family income is too much for Medicaid and too little to qualify for the offerings through ACA. So we're stuck in that gap.
It definitely became an issue in terms of my medication, because as you may or may not know, as a transplant recipient, I am required to take medications for the rest of my life. And that is to sustain the health of my kidney and to make sure that my body recognizes the kidney as a welcome part of my body and not something that shouldn't be there. So anti-rejection medication is part of my protocol, and it is quite pricey. It is very expensive.
So we're choosing between food in the house and medical needs. And there's really no way to make that choice.
When the pandemic hit and we both got COVID, I was able to get temporary Medicaid. I got full Medicaid, and then when I started working, had to get temporary Medicaid. And I'm terrified to be right back in that coverage gap again. I remember how poor my health was, both physically and mentally. I remember how stressed out I was all the time. I remember just praying all the time and just asking God, like, get me through this next day, because I have to be Wonder Woman for my kids for this day and the next day and the next day, and just praying that I could get through it.
One thing just for myself would mean that healthcare would be an option instead of being something that we have to hide from.
So it matters to me in such an incredible sense that caregivers be made whole so that they can be there.
Go back one slide, or attempt to. All right. So I'm so humbled to work with the parents who were willing to share their stories in that video. And I think that video does a good job of laying out what a good advocacy story looks like. Stories come in a lot of different forms, but one thing that a lot of stories across cultures have in common is that you will have a main character or a group of people who face a challenge and make a choice, and that choice has a consequence. And in advocacy storytelling, you use that structure very specifically. So the storyteller lays out the challenge, but the choice is made by both the storyteller and the listener to take action. And the consequence of that choice is a hopeful future that we can all reach if we take action together. So an advocacy story allows us to become part of the hero of the story, to become an us and not just a me and a you. And you see that in that video where the storytellers were sharing their challenge. But at the end, they also said, because we asked, what it would be like if they did have health insurance so that we could see that hopeful future. And then there was that very quick ask of go to the website, and that website drives people to take action. One reason that we were able to put this story together is because we did have those long-term relationships with folks. These stories were collected over more than a year and were part of a wider campaign to collect stories about folks in the coverage gap generally. And this trend kind of rose to the top through talking to these parents, that a lot of parents did have children with special needs, and that was a particular story that we wanted to tell. So we needed to be able to go back to those folks. As Lamine said, we asked for consent when we first collected their story, but we went back again and said, we have this idea to tell your story in this way. Then we went back and said, here's a draft video. How do you like it? Do you like the way you look? Do you like the words we chose? And then before we launched it, we let them know, here's the blog we're going to use, the email we're going to use, the social media that we're going to use. And then we used the heck out of it. When you've got a good story, you want to make sure those storytellers who took that risk and made that investment to tell that story get as much mileage as possible. So that story is on LinkedIn, it's on Instagram, Facebook, we put it on Twitter, we linked it in emails that we sent out, it's on our blog. We've tried, and we are continuing to push it out. If you are planning a multi-channel campaign, we find that stories are a really good first touch. So a lot of the promotion that we do on social media is short versions of these storytelling videos, because that's a great way to form that initial relationship between a person and your organization or your issue. And I'll turn it back over to Lamine.
Thank you, Claire. Okay, I would love to, we can stop sharing, and I would love to bring in Ebony into this conversation. Ebony, I would love to hear you talk about something that I've seen you do time and time again. The focus of this conversation has really mostly been on collecting stories, but as I've mentioned, and as our previous presenters mentioned, we all have a story to tell. And so, Ebony, I remember hearing you do this in one of our meetings where you asked me and everyone else to talk about their personal why. You asked us to talk about our why in reference to why we show up for this work, but I would love for you to share your why in terms of why you have center storytelling in some of your advocacy. I've seen you do this in lots of professional settings. And so Ebony, feel free to take it away.
All right, this is a story all about how my life got flipped, turned upside down. So I'd like to take a minute, just sit right there. I'll tell you how I became the prince of a town called Bel Air. So we can all empathize with Will, right? So even though his story is not our own, we can empathize. There was one of the sessions where Will Smith, one of the stories where Will Smith, he was expecting his dad to come and his dad didn't show up, and that was, probably one of the most heart-wrenching stories on that season. So I use empathy to connect with people. I tell stories for empathy. I do it for oxytocin. Oxytocin is the chemical in the brain that's responsible for empathy, and it develops connection and relationship. So when I'm able to connect with policymakers or with people, it just helps them understand a real lived experience. And so for me, I always, as a child, my childhood was very challenging. And so as a child, I'm like, okay, this is horrible. This is hard, going to bed crying or going to bed without the necessities to maintain a healthy lifestyle as a child. And I understood that. And it was hard. But now as an adult, I can understand why I was given or why I was placed in those positions, because there were issues. My family was in that gap. And so now I can understand and I can share my story and personalize that to allow people to really to pull them into my life. So that's my why. My why is is for youth development, and so I understand what kids go through, and my work is to support them and to make sure that they have what they need to be successful.
Thank you for that. I was not expecting that Will Smith reference, but I definitely love it. Claire, you helped walk us through some of the important elements of a story, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about your experience using stories as a tactic, and why this is something that's effective for communications.
Yeah, I'm really lucky to be able to work with families right now to tell their stories. I have in the past worked with farmers. I've worked with folks living with HIV. So I've told stories about a lot of different topics. I continue to come back to the strategy, and I continue to believe in the strategy because stories are, as Lamine laid out, as Tanya laid out, a very basic way to build community. And community is a very basic way to build power. And one thing I love about stories is that of all the kinds of power that we can use to affect policy change, stories are a kind of power that belong exclusively to the people who are directly affected by the issue. And so when we use stories to shape our advocacy and to ground our advocacy, we stay true to the people that as organizations we are tasked to serve. And we also, I believe, are more likely to find effective solutions. Stories are also a really great way to build emotion, and emotion is the most effective driver of action. Lamine mentioned advertisements. When you're watching ads on TV, Pepsi does not show you the nutritional label. They show you how great it feels to pop open a can and drink a Pepsi. And so we want to show people how great it feels to change policy and to transform lives. And so that's really the way that we can connect with our audience and to create that us to create change in the world.
I love that. Thank you both so much. The next question that I have is, we heard Tiffany give some advice to people who want to engage in storytelling. This whole, all of the sessions that we've heard this morning have been about storytelling. And I was wondering what advice you would give to folks in the room or who might be listening to this, who want to start collecting and using stories in their advocacy. And Ebony, if you want to take it first, and then Claire, you can jump in.
I'm not really a story collector. I've done a little bit of that with NC Child with the candle listening sessions, and they were very supportive in helping us understand how to get the consent. They were, so we were able to share how, we shared with them how we're going to use that data. So I'm not really a story collector beyond that much. I've honestly just told my story, and so I seem to always be in a position where when it's almost time for me to speak with a legislator or something happens in my life that I can kind of meld together with that situation. So everyone has a story, and Brene Brown says stories are data with the soul, and so we mentioned that a little bit earlier. So my goal is to find a way to connect the story or the issue with someone, with myself or with my family or with someone in my family or with someone I know. It is, for me, it's been pretty impactful to be able to share my story, my personal story. Again, I don't do a whole lot of sharing other stories beyond what I've done before. And the video that we just saw, it produced empathy. So our brains were exuding that oxytocin, and we were just connecting with those families. And so that's my goal. So I say, for me, it's use your own story, allow yourself to be open and vulnerable. And again, another quote from Brene, because I love her so much. But vulnerability is not winning or losing. It's having the courage to show up and be seen, even when we don't know what the outcome is going to be. So we know that those families were allowing themselves to be vulnerable, and they didn't, we don't know what the outcome of Medicaid expansion is going to be. We hope we get the outcome that we want, but we don't know. But it's still being able to go out there and just be vulnerable. It's not a weakness. Honestly, it's a sign of great courage. People who, and this is another Brene, people who wade into discomfort and vulnerability and tell their truth about their stories are the real badasses. So we need to be the ones to go out there and be that person, to put themselves out and to be that person who speaks up for the needs of others. And so again, my story is not everybody's story, but I can relate to many of the children that I work with. So again, for me, it's my advice is to find your story. Everyone has something that connects. You have a why for what you do, or you wouldn't be on this call. So use that and share that. And then again, if follow the advice of Lamine and Claire as you're collecting those stories. Again, that's not my expertise, but I have done it, and I've had the help of NC Child to do that.
It was beautiful. Thank you, Ebony. We have a Brene Brown appreciation party. She's amazing. I came into this work really excited about the power of story, and really excited about the way that story can break stigma and form relationships and break stereotypes and drive change. And one thing that I've seen is, as I mentioned, those stories belong to people first, and then it's hard work to tell your story. It can be challenging on both personal, professional, public levels to come out and share about an issue that may be stigmatized or judged by other people. And so if you're thinking about sharing your story, I would say be kind to yourself. If there's a part of you that's not ready to share yet, that's okay. I often tell people to wait at least until they've sat with the issue and are at peace with it within themselves before they let other people weigh in. And if you're thinking about asking other people to share their story, I would never tell someone to share, but if they want to share, I want to be there for them and help them have the expertise, the tools, the tactics at their fingertips to take that story as far as it can go. So one thing that we do when we work with storytellers is we talk very explicitly with them about the risks of telling their story up front. Over the years, I've seen people be discriminated against at work, sometimes to the point of losing their jobs, have mental health crises because of some of the pushback that they're facing. I had someone whose grandmother was ill, and we held a story for 2 weeks because we wanted her to be out of the hospital before we worried her about her grandson. You can never really judge what the stresses or pushback are going to be. Don't judge for someone else. Believe them about their risks and ask them to be explicit when they think through them. And then, as Lamine said, you get that consent. You get it over and over and over again until people are sick of having you ask them for consent. And if they really genuinely are starting to get annoyed with you because you're texting them every 2 days saying, can I put your story on social media again? Still give them a heads up when you use their story. So you want that full open-hearted consent that people are excited about having their story out there every time you use it. You can think about protecting folks through choosing what content is in the story. So often, if you're sharing sensitive healthcare information or family dynamics, maybe you can tell the story without that information in it. Maybe, as Lamine mentioned, you can be cautious about whether or not you're sharing people's full names. It's okay to use pseudonyms or use abbreviations, especially when you're using the names of children. Things live on the internet forever. Do you want someone to be able to Google whatever you're saying in the story about the child in 15 years when they're looking for a job? So you really want to think about what content you're putting in there. And then you want to think about what kind of support you can provide for your storytellers. So I believe that if you're a professional working with storytellers, that is a 24/7 job, and you can always be a listening ear and you can always be a thought partner. Things I've seen other organizations do to provide support include providing suicide prevention gatekeeper training to people who are collecting stories, providing financial counseling services or pro bono legal counseling for folks who are in trouble because of their story getting shared, or even in very high-risk situations, having emergency funds to help people through crises that may come about because of their stories. Those may not be necessary or possible for your organization, but there are things to think about and question. That said, if you're thinking about using stories, I would say that there is nothing more effective that we can do as change makers than stand in community with each other and tell our stories together and tell our stories publicly. It creates connection, it creates change like nothing else. So do it, just do it cautiously and do it in a way that you have each other's backs and you're looking out for your storytellers in the same way that they're looking out for the rest of us by taking that risk.
Thank you, Claire and Ebony. I have one more question, but before I go there, I just wanted to hold some space in case there are questions from the audience. And I see one from Beth. Actually, that was a comment. And so if there are no more questions if there are no questions in the chat, then I'll go ahead with one of my last questions was, and this is probably more so geared toward you, Claire, but Ebony, I would certainly invite your feedback as well. You know, we've talked about how stories are qualitative data, and there's always that danger of being transactional or mining communities for data. And so my question is, how can we inform our advocacy through stories in a way that that's ethical and respectful?
I'm going to go first, Ebony. All right. So I would repeat one piece of advice that Lamine already gave, which is pay storytellers. Storytellers are doing important campaign work and should be compensated commensurate with their contribution. There are other things we can do. So equipping storytellers to help us collect stories so that they can help shape the narrative. Provide trainings and connections that might help further people's personal goals, because storytellers may want to just share their story once and call it a day, but many of them are visionaries who are trying to form their own organizations or tell their stories in more venues or take a professional role in the field that they haven't taken yet. And if your storytelling work can equip folks to move closer to those goals, that's fantastic. And then in a decade, you have a fleet of experts and leaders who all know your organization, know your issue, and have good relationships with you. And that's an amazing thing. I would also say you want to pay attention in your stories to how power is operating in the story, that you're always depicting people as the powerful experts that they are, that the hero is always the storyteller and the community and not the person who is watching. which is one reason why we never tell stories about children on their own, not surrounded by adults, but instead tell stories about families and communities working with children to kind of even that power dynamic. And then we want to share wins for the long haul. So treat storytellers as part of your team. This is long work sometimes. We mentioned Medicaid expansion. Many of us have been working on that for a decade now. And so while that win may be a long time in coming, there are little wins, like how many people just saw the story? Did something just move out of committee? Was there a vote? Did you just have a great conversation with the legislator? Share those little victories with your storytellers so that they can stay encouraged with you, feel like be part of the team, and help you carry this campaign forward for the long haul.
And I can speak to a little bit just to your personal stories. I'm not gonna Claire is the expert there, but as far as your personal story, I have had to be very careful as I'm sharing my story, because a lot of my story has to deal with my family. And so as I'm thinking through how to tell the story, I don't want, my family members or people, my loved ones, to ever feel that they didn't do a good, they did not do a good job. So I am very careful with how I tell the story, and I'm very careful with the words that I use or the phrases, and I make sure that with my mom, sometimes I'll have to let her know that I'm going to talk about XYZ, or a family member that I'm going to talk about XYZ, depending on what it is. But just being careful that you're not harming those other people around you, like you mentioned, with children, making sure that there is and it is adult centered. So we are telling the story of the community and not specifically of that child, or however, unless it's of course your personal story. So that's what I would say, when you're telling your own story, to be careful as you share that information, that it's not going to also impact the rest of the people that you love.
Thank you. Wise words from Claire and Ebony. Very good points. All right, and I think that Malia has a question. So Malia, feel free to chime in.
Yeah, I have a question. As I'm listening to you talk, I am thinking about how you're sharing the stories that you're collecting with a lot of different audiences. And one of those audiences is policymakers and legislators, including legislators. And I'm wondering if you could share with us how policymakers or legislators have reacted to the stories that you share, and if there is a better medium or a better way to share stories with policymakers to impact change.
That is a really good question. Ebony, if it's okay with you, I'd like to let you take a stab at that first, because I know you've done that many times.
So I would personally suggest meeting with your legislator in person. One of the things I've learned from NC Child, is to kind of come up with a plan with a team, and on that team that you're meeting with your legislators with, is to have someone there that's able to tell a story that's going to impact that legislator. So if that legislator has a child who works in or has one of their adult children may work in childcare. I know of a legislator that does, and so we're able to speak to that directly, because we can use that as a catalyst to the conversation, or a support for the conversation. So I would always do in person, talking with some legislators, and in a town hall that we recently had with the YMCA, they get a lot of those emails that those sign-on emails, but he said a phone call, he said even being in person are more, or they exude, they give them more connection with the individual. I've also spoken at when they open the floor for public comment. Often those are awesome because they're recorded, and so everyone is going to have the opportunity to see those. And so whenever you're able to, if you're willing to share your personal story or a story, that you do it in public comment where everyone is going to soon have access to those stories.
Thank you. So it sounds like, of course, it's relational as well with policymakers, right? It's picking up the phone or scheduling a meeting with them. And it sounds like part of the story sharing also is about doing some prep work, right? And finding out who you're going to be talking to, and finding a way to relate to that person, right? Like it's more than just going in and sharing your story, but it's also preparing for who you're sharing your story with. So thank you. Stacy, do you have any questions?
I don't have any additional questions unless they have any last comments or thoughts for us before we close out their panel.
I wanted to say, as I've been listening today to all of the speakers, I've been hearing so much like common theme, although it's not necessarily been spoken out loud in every session, talking about bravery and courage, and the courage that it takes to share a story. Either your own personal story or as someone who is advocating for families and sharing someone else's story. Both of those are very, courageous acts. And, I'm thinking about how Lamine talked about that, when she came into this work, she's, not a trained storyteller or a story collector, right? But worked on this and developed what this would look like, right? Like how you collect stories, and making sure that people are respected throughout that process. And I put a note in the chat that I think it's important to hear all of this if you're a person who wants to collect stories, or if you're someone who wants to share your story, that NC Child has done a really nice job of laying out all of those expectations that you should have when you're going to share your personal experiences. I was also thinking about Elijah and how, he talked about organizing a march, and that, he couldn't believe that someone handed a 10-year-old a megaphone. But I think about, a 10-year-old being handed a megaphone and how brave that was of him to say, I am going to do this. And it sounds like with Elijah, he's had a lot of lessons learned throughout this experience of sharing his story and being an activist as well. And he's been incredibly brave. Thinking about Tanya, I wanted to just lift up again the myth, fact, story, and need that she talked about. I just think that if you have a story to share, to kind of keep that in mind, that this is a format you can use, and that you don't have to be Oprah in order to share your story. I'm going to send out the link to the entire video that Tanya was going to share, but you don't have to be Oprah in order to share your story. And then also early this morning, we heard from Madhu, who's talked about how the new division for child and family well-being is talking about using stories, listening to people, and then impacting policy where they can. So she shared how, during the formula shortage, they heard from parents saying, hey, I need this to change, and that impacted change immediately. And that's not something we always see happen in advocacy work where there's immediate change. But to hear, though, from someone in leadership at the Department of Health and Human Services that hearing a story impacted change immediately is incredible. And it just shows you the power of sharing your stories and experiences. So it's kind of my some of the thoughts that I had listening to all of the speakers today.
Thank you, Malia. And thank you, Lamine, Ebony, and Claire for the wonderful information, the stories that were shared from those that weren't able to be here today. We appreciate it. And, you know, like Malia said, each one of these speakers and these topics left us with some thinking and some to-dos and some reminders, you know, anywhere from stories help shape services and sports, whether it's good or bad, to help, you know, stories helping to connect us, each of us, with our day-to-day basis, right? And then like Malia said, we're gonna hone this in on you, you know, the myth, the fact, the story, and the need, you know, that was awesome. And that, you know, we talked about the science of storytelling and that it's a survival skill, right? And that, you know, storytelling is like a series of chapters of our life. So each one of these, and then we heard some, you know, we wrapped it up with some very great stories here with this panel. So we hope that you have enjoyed today's presenters and that you have some takeaways. So here at the end, we have saved a few minutes so that you guys can have a chance to complete today's evaluation. We'll share a link in the chat. And we really appreciate any feedback that you guys give us, because what we do is we take that and we help it shape what our next policy events will look like. So please take the last few minutes if you can and do that. Thank you so much for being here. We look forward to seeing you at our next Institute on Wednesday, October 26th. And again, remember, if you would like to attend, it is a separate link, so you will have to register for both, and the content there will be different. Thank you guys so much.